Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to look at the major themes in chapters 9 and 10 of Daniel Jurgens' The Prize. And we have to prepare ourselves to adopt a very different kind of perspective starting these chapters really through the end of the semester. Up to this point, the story we've been telling is largely a story about United States history. The major developments happen within the United States. And that's indicative that the United States is indeed a full technological generation ahead of even the most advanced Western powers like Britain and France, and as we're going to see increasingly in the coming weeks, several technological generations ahead of the rest of the world. But in chapters 9 and 10, Daniel Jurgen is going to turn to the international competition for oil, and the references here are going to be very different than the ones that we've seen so far. Hopefully you come to the class with some basic narrative framework for American history, say from the end of the Civil War to the outbreak of the World Wars. You may not have known who Edwin Drake was before you took this class, or Patio Higgins, but you probably had a pretty good idea who Thomas Edison was, and you probably had a general sense that this period from the Civil War to the World Wars was a period of kind of unrestrained American capitalism and the rule of the robber barons, and that the politics of the early 20th century in America was a reaction against that form of economic organization. But as we turn now to look at global events, it's likely that your kind of background narrative for this period and this framework is maybe a little thinner, maybe a little vaguer, a little more ephemeral in your mind, and it's going to be increasingly less likely that you'll have common references in your head to be able to attach these stories to. So this part of the text can get more complicated, but as we move from here to the end of the term, we're going to be increasingly taking a global or international perspective and kind of occasionally checking back on what's happening in domestic American history. And the thing is, the kind of economic culture of the United States in the last third of the 19th century is very, very unusual. There's basically no place else in the world, no major industrial power like the United States, that allows the kind of free market capitalism that we've been talking about for the last couple class sessions. On the cusp of the 20th century, virtually the entire planet is structured under the geopolitics of the European imperial system. European colonization begins essentially in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and over the course of 4 centuries, by the cusp of the 20th century, more than 90% of the inhabitable portions of the globe are going to be under the legal and political jurisdiction of either one of the European powers, the United States, or Russia. Virtually the entire globe has been colonized by the end of the 19th century, and one common way, certainly not the only way of understanding the world wars, but one common way is to look at the world wars as the final collapse and implosion that was brought about by the competition among the European states to kind of gobble up the rest of the world as part of their possessions. So you have to imagine a world now that we're going to enter into where empire is not like a dirty, embarrassing, shameful word, but it is the height of European or Western civilization. That these peoples in this time period, including people in the United States, put a kind of positive moral affirmation on the project of empire building. If you are familiar with Rudyard Kipling, the great British poet of this time, he was sort of the poet of the British Empire, and his famous poem, The White Man's Burden, right? Which is exactly as the title implies, that it is the burden of white European people to sort of go around the globe and discover all these primitive, uncivilized, basically brown-skinned people around the rest of the world, and to bring to them European civilization, the ideas of private property, ideas about Christianity and all the rest, and that this was an elevating experience for Europeans, right? That it was God had implanted this duty upon them. So you really have to put yourself in a mindset that's so antithetical to the way we think about relationships among international bodies today, but you have to transfer transform yourself into this world. So, as we turn now to think about World War I and its impact on the oil industry, we need to take just a moment. Jurgen covers some of this material in Chapter 3, which I did not assign you, but I would encourage you to go take a look at. We're really thinking about two regions in the world that had become sources of oil extraction roughly by the time of World War I. A couple of different sites within what we call as moderns the Middle East, but which most Europeans at the turn of the century would have referred to as the Near East, which is roughly the same period. We're going to look at a couple of regions there, and then in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, what today is Indonesia, but was a Dutch colonial possession in the 19th century and was referred to as the East Indies. So let's turn to both of those regions in turn and look at the development of the oil extraction by the end of the 19th century. The biggest, most important, and most ancient region for extracting oil outside of the United States is Baku. In the map on the left of your screen, if you find the Caspian Sea in the upper right-hand corner, if you follow the western shore of the Caspian Sea, starting from the bottom up, not quite halfway up from south to north, you'll find that little promontory sticking out into the sea and that little designation there, Baku. Baku is the name of both the principal city on that peninsula, but is also the name of the peninsula itself. I referred to this region in the introductory video for the class. This region was well known, say, to the ancient Romans and ancient peoples as a source of pitch and tar for their own productions. And that image I showed you of the Temple of the Eternal Flame is here in the mountains of Baku. This was a source of religious worship for the Zoroastrians, that is, that ancient Persian culture that long predates Islamicism. In the last third of the 19th century, as Europeans were watching those crazy Americans develop oil in all of its different capacities and all of its different potentials, industrial potential, when Europeans started looking for a source of their own oil, it was natural for them to go first to Baku, right? That was the place that they would be best familiar with. Now, in the 19th century, really extending long before, this area is under the control of the Russian Empire. If you look at the map, stretching between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, Baku exists in the modern nation of Azerbaijan, and just to the west, these two nations of Georgia and Armenia, there's a mountain chain that runs through them that connects the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea called the Caucasus Mountains. And that's a very ancient territorial boundary, sort of separating the peoples from the north that will ultimately become the Russians, and the variety of peoples to the south. Most important is the Persians. In the 19th century, there is this is a kind of boundary between the Russian Empire under the Tsars to the north and the Persian monarchy, which is a close ally of the British Empire. The British have cultivated the Persians in this region for reasons we'll talk about in the next slide. So Europeans seeking to develop their own source of oil have to negotiate with the Russian Tsar, which is very tricky with European politics, but neither the Europeans nor the Tsar have the technological capacity to turn Baku into a modern oil-producing region and enter Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil are going to come into Baku. They're going to bring the latest American technology supported by European capital. There's wealthy families in Europe that are investing in Standard Oil's project here in Baku under the oversight of the Russian Tsar. The chart in the lower right shows the beginning of Azerbaijan oil production in the 1880s, and you see that first big rise there leading up to essentially 1905, where Baku oil is being brought online. Effectively, the region of Baku is Standard Oil in Europe. Standard Oil is going to become the major distributor. Now they're going to adopt a whole variety of different sort of retail labels, right? They're going to have different retail companies in each European nation, so there'll be a whole variety of kind of labels that get attached to this oil, but it's John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil that's behind it. One of the consequences of World War I is the communist revolution in Russia, right? And the rise of Lenin and Stalin and the whole cast of characters. When that happens at the end of World War I, Baku is going to be included within the Russian and ultimately the Soviet sphere. So in a couple of class sessions when we talk about the division of the globe into East and West, the rivalry between the United States and its Western allies and the Soviet Union and its Eastern allies, which is largely a story that begins in the 1930s and really accelerates after World War II, this region of Baku will become by far the most important source of oil for the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. So it's going to get sort of lost to the West with World War I, but here in this early period, in the pre-World War I period, this is considered essentially Standard Oil in Europe. The second important region for oil production in the Near East is along the northern shore of the Persian Gulf in the Zagros Mountains in the modern nation of Iran, but until the 20th century, for thousands of years literally preceding the 20th century, would have been known as Persia. The discovery of oil in this region in the last third of the 19th century is really the result of British engineering and British geologists exploring. Persia has, in the 19th century, a kind of unique relationship with Britain. The center of the British Empire, its most productive colony in the entire world and the most valuable source of raw materials for its home industry, is India and the Indian subcontinent. So the British have their major colonial outpost in India, and they cultivate relationships, of course, to the east and west to try to have sort of friendly and subordinate governments in Persia to cooperate with them in resisting the inroads of the Russians from the north. This competition between Britain and Russia and the kind of the modern boundary that we find on the southern border of Russia really is the result of what was called the Great Game over the course of the 19th century. And the monarchy, the royal family in Persia, is called the Qajar family, Qajar, the Qajar family. Sort of is their diplomatic skill is playing the Russians and the Britons off against each other to try to maintain their independence. Now, the British are interested, and we're going to talk more about this in coming class sessions, in sort of protecting the littoral of the coastline from India along the Indian Ocean, right, all along the eastern coastline of Africa, around its southern tip and up, because shipping in this period, up until the opening of the Suez Canal in the 1880s, is dependent on steamboats, right, and sailboats preceding that, and steamboats in particular, they have coal-fired engines. They can't go very long at sea without returning to shore to load up with more coal. And so the British are going to establish, if you will, a kind of series of bases all along the southern shore of Persia, right, as it abuts to the Indian Ocean. The Gulf states, Oman and Qatar and Bahrain and Yemen, are going to ultimately be the products of the British Navy cultivating friendly relationships with sort of tribes, if you will, along the coast of the Persian Gulf and all along the coast of Africa. So the British are highly invested in, if you will, the southern regions of Persia, and as they watch those Americans discovering oil in Pennsylvania, they see a very similar kind of geologic structure in southern Persia, right? They see these great mountains, these Zagros mountains that are rich in coal. Everybody knows that they're rich in coal, but they also start searching for those places where the petroleum is excreted to the surface, and they're making significant discoveries sort of in the 1890s. So, somewhat differently than the story with Baku and Standard Oil and the Russian Tsar, here you have a kind of state monopoly and the development of a state company. British Petroleum. We're going to hear a lot about British Petroleum all the way through the end of this semester. One of the distinguishing features of British Petroleum that you want to keep in mind is it is essentially a department of the British government. So it's not a private company in the American sense, right? There are stockholders and shareholders that get dividends, so it's a complicated structure. But British Petroleum as a corporation has on its board of trustees people appointed by the British Parliament and the British King, right? The British political system determines who's in charge of the company, and that means that the company is a kind of direct agent of British colonial policy. Now, that's very different than the American context, but it makes perfect sense in terms of the 19th century. This would have been a common way for European countries to carry out their imperial policies, that is, to send a big company, either state-owned or privately owned, and have that company impose rules on the local population. It sounds very strange from an American perspective, but this was a common mode of European imperialism. So in Persia, we're going to see the development of the British oil industry. First with this company called Anglo-Persian Oil, and then as we get into Jurgen chapter 9, he's going to describe to you the organization of British Petroleum. The third region that is important to understand as a source of oil production in the 19th century is all the way on the other side of the globe in the South Pacific, in the modern nation of Indonesia, which was at the time a Dutch colonial possession and known as the Dutch East Indies. Now, these island nations, these island chains that sort of stretch between Southeast Asia and Australia, have a very complicated colonial history, as indeed does Southeast Asia. There's a kind of checkerboard of different European claims throughout this region, and you may be familiar, if you're familiar with Chinese history, that this was a period in which the Hermit Kingdom was being opened up to colonial colonization by the European powers, and each of the European powers were within China and kind of frequently coming into military conflict and conflict in how to suppress the Chinese population. So there's a open competition, have been for centuries. Indeed, one of the kind of common conflicts of the 18th and 19th century, one European nation gets mad at another European nation, so they send a naval squadron out here to the South Pacific and steal the other country's islands, right? And it's a similar kind of story in the 17th century with the Caribbean islands is played out here in the South Pacific. So there's a kind of open and direct competition among the European states in this region. The Dutch control. Now, the Dutch are a great naval power in the early period of Europe of colonization, the early stages in the 17th and 18th century, but they really have been eclipsed by the other modern, more industrializing powers of Europe by the middle of the 19th century. Enter into this story, this character, Henry Detterding, who is a Dutch national who essentially gets the official license from the Dutch government to come out to their possessions in the South Pacific and explore for oil. Most of these islands are sort of volcanic island chains, right? And especially among the ancient islands, that material will pile on top of the original source lignite, become a rich source of coal, and where cracks open in that kind of volcanic crust, petroleum naturally seeps to the surface. So again, though this is much closer to the water, right, to the ocean level, it has that same kind of mountain structure. It's essentially the same geology that the Americans were discovering in northwest Pennsylvania. Now, because the Dutch are a relatively weak European colonial power, and they sort of exist in constant fear that the other European states will come and seize their possessions. Detterding is very eager to develop an alliance with a stronger state, that is, to join his company with another European interest. And there's a kind of competition, a kind of bidding war between Rockefeller and Standard Oil, and this new character, Samuel Marcus, who is a British subject, a kind of wealthy Brit. He has a trading company based in London, but really is about trading goods from all of Britain's different colonial possessions and bringing them back to Britain to sell, called the Shell Transportation Company. And ultimately, these two characters, Henry Dettering and Samuel Marcus, a Dutch and a Brit, are going to come together to form a common company, the Shell Motor Company. And so that's the origins of Shell. It is this Dutchman, a kind of colonial adventurer who discovers oil, or at least sends his geologists out there, kind of like George Bissell and the original Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company. And this also creates an interesting dynamic within the British Empire, the British oil system. So the Brits are going to have one kind of official state company, British Petroleum, that is always closely associated with the British government and is really charged with carrying out British policy within the places that they explore for oil. And then this other company, which is sort of half British, half Dutch, not quite as trustworthy. Jurgen will comment about this in terms of war policy and who the British government is going to award oil contracts to. Shell, because it is kind of half British, half Dutch, is always going to be a little bit suspect in the nationalistic politics within Britain. But it will also form the second major player. The most important, British Petroleum and Shell, are going to be the two most important European companies, both of them British, that are going to cooperate with the Americans in the later stages, especially when we get to the post-World War II period. So, Jurgen describes some of this in greater and other and lesser detail in Chapter 3, the chapter that I didn't assign. Let's pick up now with the story that he tells in Chapter 9 about the kind of on-the-ground strategy in World War I. Jurgen has two primary themes in Chapter 9 regarding the events of World War I. The first theme is to relate or kind of narrate anecdotes from battlefield events, not so much to explain kind of the course of the war and why one side or the other won, but just enough anecdotes to illustrate how military strategy and military tactics are adapting to the mechanization of warfare. There's a series of inventions, if you will, or innovations and developments of new military platforms around the internal combustion engine that are going to profoundly impact the nature of warfare. Jurgen's second theme is government policies, regulations, and especially the negotiations among the governments, particularly the Allied governments, over access to oil and the distribution of oil resources. The national leaders are going to become increasingly self-aware and recognize, particularly by the end of the war, that access to oil is a national security issue. It's a national security resource. And they've come to understand by the end of the war that whoever has the most oil is very likely to win the war. Now, if you're not familiar with the World War I era, I would encourage and invite you to hop over to YouTube and search for documentaries. World War I documentaries are really wonderful to watch and fascinating. First, because this is the very earliest film camera technology, that is the movies, and really great developments in photography. So we get modern images that really are distinct from 19th century images. So the documentaries can be great, and you can see in those images the transition in the nature of warfare. The early battles of World War I are really fought like 19th century battles. That is, you'll see mass cavalry charges, officers on horseback with their swords drawn and pistols on their hips, and especially the masses of troops kind of lined up in square rectangles rectangular formations in very close proximity to each other with their artillery not too far behind them, just essentially standing and shooting at each other, right? It looks very strange from a 20th century perspective, but they really started the war with 19th century tactics. The usefulness of the automobile is apparent very early in the war. Jurgen narrates the story of the Paris taxi armada, and they need to rush the French troops out to the front lines, and they don't have access to the trains. So all the taxi drivers in Paris who have automobiles help to ferry the troops to the front line. It saves and stalls the Germans and saves the almost certain capture of Paris. And so from the very earliest days of the war, the ability of the automobile to not have to be confined to railroad tracks, right? I mean, the great kind of transportation device before World War I would be the railroads, and really whichever European power had the most sophisticated railroad system, that is, the ability to move troops and artillery and horses around very quickly from one region to the other, that was a critical element of military dominance. And really, the Germans had the most sophisticated railroad system on the cusp of World War I. The automobile, or the truck, or what the Brits and the French will call the lorry, right, which you see in that image on the right-hand side of the screen, that just basic flatbed truck framework, is going to create extraordinary mobility. You can move within regions much more quickly than you ever could before. And of course, the image of the ambulance here, you can bring your wounded back, which is very important. You can rush supplies and ammunition to the front and have much more effective transportation networks. The automobile and the truck really changed the way commanders have to think about both what opportunities they have to attack the other troops, but especially their own vulnerabilities. Tanks are developed in the very last stages of the war. They really only appear in the last year or so, and they're a specific answer to the unique form of war in Western Europe, that is, the trenches that were developed. So the line between Germany and France is really established very early in the war and moves very little over 4 years, despite the millions of casualties that are thrown at that no man's land. And extensive network of trenches, that is, thousands of miles of trenches are dug that form that boundary, and the tank is developed as a way of traversing the no man's land between the trenches. They capture the imagination in a way that the other devices don't. You have to really imagine, they're almost like a Transformer movie, right? These are horrific robot creatures from the future that no matter how many times you shoot at them, they seem to be impenetrable, and they're bringing certain doom, right? This is a horrific kind of image for the soldiers whose experience before the war would have been kind of the chivalry of riding on your horse and shooting with, having the bravery to stand there while the other guy shoots at you and you shoot back, right? This is a kind of horrific, futuristic, dystopian kind of warfare. And if you are at all familiar with the literature of the 1920s, there was a great HBO series years ago called Boardwalk Empire. The kind of what we would call PTSD of soldiers who were serving in the trenches, and particularly those who had to face the tanks, and their kind of nightmarish experience, how futuristic that was. Now, we can see it in the roots of modern warfare, and the tank is, of course, going to be one of the most common platforms by World War II. But the nightmare, futuristic, sci-fi, dystopian kind of emblem of the tank really resonates in this period. Finally, of course, airplanes come on the scene. Now, it's important not to overemphasize, again, the airplane's importance. These are very lightweight biplanes. They have minimal capacity to carry payload. That is to say, they're not carrying racks of bombs that they're dropping on the enemy. They're primarily used at the beginning of the war through the middle of the war as reconnaissance, and they have an extraordinary advantage. Think of modern satellite and GPS technology and how precisely we are able to locate our enemies on the battlefield in the 21st century. Well, Go back a century and imagine not being able to take a bird's eye view of your enemy, right? You can't get above and see their ability. For centuries, that was the nature of commanders, military commanders, and so you sent spies across enemy lines to try to map out where their soldiers are located, where their artillery and stuff are located. With the invention of the airplane, you can get above, circle over, and because there's no effective anti-aircraft devices, right? They haven't developed anti-aircraft artillery yet. And so those planes circling above you really are immune from the enemy's fire. They can stay up there for as long as the gasoline lasts, and it's much more effective to send up kind of a cartographer map maker, right? A guy to sit in the back seat with a piece of paper and to sketch out the enemy positions. That's going to do much more damage to the enemy than trying to send them up there with a crate of hand grenades or small artillery shells that they can dangle over the edge of the cockpit and drop on the enemy. Think a little bit, if you followed the news footage of today's current Ukrainian war, you've undoubtedly seen some of those images of Ukrainian drones hovering over the Russian soldiers, and the Russian soldiers can fire their rifles or pistols at those drones, but it's just impossible to hit them at that range, right? The accuracy that you would need with those small arms, it's virtually impossible to hit those drones. And those drones can just hover and hover and hover and wait for the moment to drop their little payload. Well, that's a similar kind of feeling in the World War I. No one has ever been able to. They have hot air balloons in the late 19th century, but those are relatively easy to shoot down. Not like an airplane, and that you can send them up. Now, by the end of the war, we're going to figure out the technology to be able to shoot machine guns out of the airplanes, and the key invention there is to be able to time the rotation of the propeller with the firing of the gun, because of course you don't want to put holes through your propeller or through your wings. But that really is a development at the end of the war, the last year or so of the war. And so there are going to be kind of the notorious dogfights, if you know the story of the Red Baron and whatnot, and the biplanes up there shooting at each other. That's really, again, just in the last stages of the war. So plane technology is going to greatly increase the range of our kind of intelligence and reconnaissance. Think of it like the advantage the United States and advanced technology countries have today with their satellite technology, the way they can see people on the ground. That's really the big impact of airplanes in World War I. All of these devices, of course, vastly increase the quantity of oil and petroleum that the nations need to continue fighting the war. If you have a fleet of trucks but you run out of gas, or maybe you have gas but you can't get it transported to the front line where the trucks and the tanks are, all that is a pile of iron waiting to get blown up by the enemy. All of these devices and all of the tactics that emerge around them depend on access to oil. Now, if you do come to the class with some familiarity with the World War I era and kind of the grand strategy of the war, the images and stories that you have in your mind are almost certainly based in the battles in Western Europe and the trench warfare and the battle between Britain and France on one side and Germany on the other primarily. If you have studied the period, you may have a sense that there was this vast Eastern Front between Russia on one side and Germany and Austro-Hungary on the other. And in fact, it was the Eastern Front which stretched over 1,000 miles and involved almost inconceivable quantities of troops, millions of men involved, and vastly greater casualties than occurred on the Western Front, though certainly the Western Front was horrific. You may have a sense, in fact, that it was this Eastern Front that really determined the outcome of the war. Even if you have studied the subject, it's unlikely that you have come to the class with a very clear sense of the battles and the campaigns that were fought in the Middle East. This is sort of the southeastern corner of the Ottoman Empire, which is the third great Axis power in World War I. These are kind of obscure campaigns because they don't have a particularly large impact on the outcome of World War I. The Ottomans have to keep some troops down here to fight the British in this region that they might otherwise have sent up to the Eastern Front, but the Ottomans were not a particularly important partner in the Axis. They get defeated battle after battle in the early stages of the war, and it's not clear that these troops would have made a very big difference. So the Middle Eastern campaigns are not so important for the outcome of World War I, but they're absolutely essential to understand the aftermath of the war and the negotiations over how this region is going to be sort of carved up into modern nation states, and then the negotiation over oil resources and oil claims with those nations. So there are sort of two distinct British campaigns in this region. We think of them as the Palestine campaign and the Mesopotamian campaign. We talked in the last session or earlier in this session that the kind of centerpiece of the British Empire is in India, and so the British are highly invested in maintaining security, forts along the coast of the Indian Ocean, all the way along the Middle East, down the coast of Africa, and up the other side. We did not mention yet that another kind of central base of the British Empire is in Egypt. Now, Egypt is a little more complicated, and we'll talk about it more in coming class sessions. It has its own independent monarchy, but that monarchy is a kind of puppet to the British power. It's deeply in debt, and especially in the 1880s, the British send the British companies in to build the Suez Canal, and they stationed troops along the Suez Canal, and so it is a kind of military base for the British Empire. So the first campaign that the British are going to organize is they're going to build up their troops down in their base in Egypt, send them on trains across the Sinai Desert, and march them up through what we think of as modern day Israel and up into Lebanon, what would at the time would have been called Palestine, which is that whole coastal region, basically from the crest of the mountains down to the Mediterranean Sea. The Ottoman soldiers defending these towns in Palestine are woefully outmatched by British technology, and so the battles are not particularly significant. The Ottomans just sort of flee and surrender and as they go. But what is really important about the Palestine campaign for the future politics of this region is that the British reach out to these Arabs in the interior of the Arab Peninsula. That this is going to be the root of the family that's going to come to rule Saudi Arabia. Faisal Saud is the leader of these kind of Arab guerrilla men. The British recruit them to help them sort of guerrilla attacks on the interior from the frontiers so that the British soldiers can hug the railroad and the coastline so they can stay close to their supplies. And so the Palestine campaign is this kind of cooperative effort between the British and the kind of, if you will, native Arabs, the interior Arabs, the rough and ready frontier Arabs that live in the desert. The British call them out to attack the hated Ottoman power, because of course the Arabs have been living under Ottoman rule, and those Ottomans are Turks, not Arabs ethnically, and so there's a kind of native resentment against the imperial rule of those Turks to the north. Now the key element here is the British are going to promise Faisal, the leader of the Arabs, Faisal Saud, join us, help us defeat those terrible Ottomans, and when the war is over, we are going to make sure that all the Arabs get a nation state, a nation for the Arabs, right? And that's the idea that Faisal Saud has in his mind when he comes to the negotiating table in the aftermath of World War I. Now the problem is the British are going to make the same promise to multiple Arab leaders, right? And that's the essential dilemma of the post-war negotiations in this region, and the rivalry among the nation states that are formed: Iraq and Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, these countries, and Kuwait and Oman and the Gulf states. These states that are going to emerge begin with the kind of negotiations around this Palestine campaign. Right, so as a military matter, it's not a particularly tough fight for the British. They are totally outmatched the Turks in their weaponry and their mobility, but the alliance that the British create to carry out this campaign is fundamental to understanding the aftermath of the war. Now, the second campaign that the British carry out during World War I is in what the Ottomans would have called and Europeans would have called Mesopotamia, which is, of course, the ancient, earliest period of human civilization dates from this Fertile Crescent, if you will, if you're familiar with that term. Mesopotamia is the region and the floodplains between these two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? And they have they empty out into the Persian Gulf. So the British sail up their navy up the Persian Gulf. They land their troops at Basra, and they carry them up on rafts essentially up the Tigris and the Euphrates River to the what is the current site of Baghdad, and just south of Baghdad is the site of the ancient city of Babylon. And the reason that's geographically important is it's the place where the Tigris and Euphrates come closest to touching, right? It's where the distance between them is the narrowest. So whoever controls this region can control the traffic up and down these two large rivers. Now, the British are going to march up to Baghdad. They're going to build a big military base and station their troops. And ultimately, they're going to take campaigns increasingly north. They're trying to get to that city. If you follow the Euphrates River up almost due north from Baghdad to the city of Mosul. And that may be a city that's familiar to you if you followed the news from that region and U.S. military intervention in that region over the last couple of decades. But Mosul is sort of where those Zagros mountains that I described to you, they're sort of in the foothills of those mountains. So if you imagine a mountain chain moving sort of northwest to southeast along the north shore of the Persian Gulf and then continuing up, Mosul sits right in the foothills of those mountains, and there is going to be a very important oil discoveries there when we get into the 1920s and the 1930s. So the British are very interested in, remember, they're in Persia. They've already discovered oil along the north bank of the Persian Gulf in those Zagros mountains, and their geologists have the idea that you're going to continue to find oil resources all through that mountain chain. So the British enter Mesopotamia with the idea of creating a military bastion that will connect the oil resources of the north end of Mesopotamia and transportation routes down so that they can load it on their ships down in the Persian Gulf. There is really no other strategic value of this region other than securing these oil resources. Now, when the British enter this region, Mesopotamia, they are going to declare that this is now the state of Iraq. And they're going to just give that name to the people. What under the Ottomans would have been three very distinct regions: the lower region around Basra, the central region around Baghdad or Babylon, and that northern region around Mosul, are three distinct ethnic groups, three distinct peoples, if you will. For more than 1,000 years, they would have thought of themselves as separate peoples, but because the British are trying to connect the oil resources in the north with the transportation routes down to water traffic, right, and to get the oil on their boats in the south, they need to connect those three regions together into this one thing. And we'll talk more about the origins of Iraq in the coming class sessions. The other important theme in Chapter 9 is government policies regarding regulating the production of oil during wartime, and particularly the negotiations among the Allied governments over the distribution of oil among the troops in the war. Jürgen describes the organization by President Woodrow Wilson of the National Petroleum War Service Committee. And this committee is just one example of war industry boards. Essentially what the Petroleum War Service Committee is the heads of all of those companies that had been created by USV Standard Oil when the U.S. government busted up all the oil companies, and as well as the most important of the independents that had emerged during that same time period, Texaco and Gulf and Union Oil and whatnot. The federal government brought the heads of all these companies together for the purposes of the war because the federal government needed absolutely astronomical quantities of oil and gasoline for the troops, both for U.S. troops and for the Allied troops that we were supporting. They needed those quantities delivered on a regular basis at a consistent, stable price, right? And if they had simply left it to the market to determine, of course, the price would skyrocket because of the demands that the military put on the supplies of oil. So you really have to appreciate the kind of irony of this 180-degree turn of the federal government. Under Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican, the federal government was, if you will, hostile to concentrations of capital and company under the trust and the robber baron system. And so the federal government devoted its resources to busting up Standard Oil. Just 3 years later, when the war breaks out in Europe and really when the U.S. gets ready to enter the war by the end of 1915, the U.S. government now has to bring all those leaders of the way it had kind of shattered the industry. It needs to bring them all together into a kind of cartel, and it's going to demand to exert federal authority to fix prices and fix supply deliveries. We're going to see this kind of vacillation again and again through the remainder of the class. The politics of oil are often sort of on a pendulum that is different than the pendulum of the market. Jurgen does a nice job of pointing that out. He also explains the Inter-Allied Petroleum Conference, which is ostensibly an agreement between the state governments, that is, the government of the United States, the government of Great Britain, the government of France, over how the different oil supplies and gasoline supplies, when they arrive at the front, how they will be distributed among the troops. But in fact, it's really the leaders of two companies, the American company Standard Oil in New Jersey and the British company Shell. This again is one of the first examples of an international agreement that has this kind of multi-layered approach. There is the layer of geopolitics in which governments negotiate the legality of things, but then there are the oil companies that have to actually go in and implement that policy, and there's an ambiguous relationship when the oil companies do so because their interests and government interests are not always aligned, and that's another dynamic that we're going to see through the remainder of the semester. The broader point to emphasize here is that both the National Petroleum War Service Committee and the Inter-Allied Petroleum Conference are just two examples that happen to be focused upon oil, but that especially within the United States, the federal government is stepping in to regulate any number of sectors of the economy for the exact same purpose. Steel production is essential for the war needs. So the federal government establishes a war industry board that establishes the price of steel, fixes the wages of the workers in the steel industry, all because the federal government says these resources are essential to our national security, right? They're essential to the success of the troops. This period then represents a dramatic increase in federal authority over the economy. Really unprecedented, or at least not since the Civil War. And even in the Civil War, you're really talking about a federal government that controls the New England and the Midwest, and nothing like this kind of industrial infrastructure. It is, if you will, a kind of precursor to next the New Deal, and then when we get to World War II, which really is total mobilization for the war effort, the American economy is going to come to be regulated in every minutia by the federal government under the justification of the needs of the war effort. That impulse to concentrate power for this reason, especially within the oil industry, is in tension with the kind of American libertarian free market individual competition spirit that we've also been following since the beginning of the semester. And it's this kind of undulation between these two cultural values that is really the valuable kind of insight and theme that Jurgen is trying to communicate to you in this chapter 9. Jurgen opens chapter 10 with the parade celebrating the British and French victory in World War I, and French Prime Minister Henry Clemenceau and British Prime Minister Lloyd George sort of haggling over oil claims in the Middle East. That is a kind of fitting anecdote that captures the spirit of the post-World War I period. But while Jurgen is going to focus on the division of those former Ottoman lands, remember that the British had taken in the Palestine and Mesopotamia campaigns, that's going to be Jurgen's focus. It's really difficult to understand both the politics of that period and especially the post-World War II period, as this region is going to get sort of carved up into nation states, without understanding the contrast between the settlement and the peace treaty at the end of the war as it affected Europe in comparison to the division of lands in the Middle East. Hopefully you come to the class with at least some vague familiarity with the Versailles Conference and the Versailles Treaty, which is the big international treaty which dictates the terms of the end of the war. Essentially, Germany and what's left of Austria and Hungary are going to surrender to Britain and France and the United States, and the Versailles Treaty dictates the terms of that surrender. Overall, it's a pretty reparations heavy surrender. That is to say, Germany and the post-Austrian and Hungarian states are going to owe the Western Allies a ton of money. But in those negotiations, the United States plays a very unique role, and this is perhaps the thing that is most closely associated with the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. The Americans come to those negotiations with a kind of spirit of anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism. Woodrow Wilson gives a famous speech at the conference called the 14 Points, and the speech literally lists 14 principles that the Americans stand for. You may be familiar that one of those 14 points is the establishment of an international body of peace, the League of Nations. And in fact, the League of Nations is going to be launched in the aftermath of World War I. Ironically, of course, the United States will be one of the few countries that does not adopt the League of Nations treaty and so never becomes an official member. But Woodrow Wilson came to the conference with a series of principles, an attempt to establish principles for an international order of cooperation and the dismantling of the European colonial empire. So, in Europe, in particular, the United States stood for the principle of self-determination, and what Wilson meant by that was all the different ethnic peoples of Eastern Europe, that is, what the Americans considered the colonial subject peoples of the Austro-Hungarian and the German empires, right? That those ethnic peoples deserved nation states of their own, that there's a kind of dignity of a people to have a country for themselves. Now, of course, you can kind of infinitely subdivide ethnic groups, but the important distinctions that were made in the Versailles Treaty first were that the Poles should have their own country, that Poland should be established for the Poles, the Lithuanians, Lithuania for the Lithuanians, the Latvia for the Latvians, etc., and then down in kind of the southern eastern portion of Europe, the Romanians that belong to, or those regions that were ethnically Romanian, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, should now be joined to the nation of Romania, that the Czechs and the Slovaks deserve their own country, that all the Slavs in the southern portion would be organized together into Yugoslavia, etc. In other words, in the settlement of Europe, because the United States played a kind of partnership role, even though the Treaty of Versailles was, sort of vengeful and demanding reparations of the defeated parties, it also contained terms that led to the liberation of these sort of subject colonial peoples. The post-war settlement and division of lands for the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and North Africa followed a very different path and was guided by very different principles than in Europe. One important reason for this difference is the Americans played a much smaller role. They had much less influence in decisions made in this region because they never entered troops in this region. They had a stronger voice in the negotiations over Europe because American troops had served in the last 2 years of the war and really come in and saved the Allies in those last 2 years of the war, really year and a half. So you can see this declining influence in Wilson's 14-point speech. In the point related to self-determination, Wilson did not qualify that principle to any specific group. It was a declaration that all peoples deserve a nation state of their own. And yet, in point number 12 in the 14-point speech, Wilson had to make a particular qualification for the lands of the Ottoman Empire. Point 12 read, "The Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty, but the other nationalities, which are now under Turkish rule, should be assured an undoubted security of life and an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development." Now that's quite a bit of politician speak there, right? Because an absolutely unmolested opportunity sounds like a wonderful thing. It sounds like complete autonomy, and yet it must be something less than secure sovereignty, right? Because only the Turkish portion of the Ottoman Empire is going to get this thing called secure sovereignty. All the other nationalities are going to get this other lesser thing, the absolute unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. So those are sort of honey-coated words, right? They sound wonderful, but they nevertheless mark a distinct second status, right? A kind of secondary lesser than status for these peoples. And what the diminished American influence in the negotiations in this region really show is that it's just a happenstance that Britain and France's imperial ambitions happened to align with American principles when it came to Europe. That is to say, the British and the French weren't opposed to busting up the German Empire and busting up the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, not because they had some particular sympathy with the Poles and the Czechs and the Slovaks and whatnot, but because they were eager to see the German and Austrian-Hungarian empires weakened, right? They were eager to see them carved up and made smaller so that they would pose less of a threat to Britain and France in the future. So the British and French diplomats, they didn't have to necessarily agree with the Americans about the reasons why it was a good thing for all these new countries to be created, to nevertheless let the Americans spout off and pontificate with all their kind of romantic principles, right, about the freedom of the peoples of the world, because the end result was consistent with their interest. Very different here than in the Middle East. And the key to understanding the difference is to know just a little bit about the Ottoman Empire and how different it was than Germany and Austria-Hungary in this period. The Ottoman Empire had been the greatest empire in Europe and Near Asia for some 300 years back in the 1300s, 1400s, and 1500s, and had been in a state of accelerating decline, really from the opening of the exploration of the oceans, the circumnavigation of the globes, and all the great kind of European explorers. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the Ottoman Empire controlled the boundary, the Silk Road, the commerce between East and West. Because those goods had to travel overland, they had to travel through the Ottoman Empire, and that was the principal source of the Ottoman Empire's wealth. Once kind of global traffic with the emergence of colonialism and the ability of the Europeans to sail the globe, they were able to skirt around the Ottoman Empire and take their trade directly from the east back to Europe without having to pay those Ottoman taxes. And really, it takes centuries for it to happen, but from that moment, the Ottoman power is going to decline. Over the course of the 19th century, that is the 1800s, the most powerful European countries progressively kind of carved up the Ottoman Empire, but in a unique way. They didn't tend to go in and conquer it with their military and claim this is now Britain's or this is now France. Rather, what they tended to do was send companies in, develop economic commercial relationships with the local rulers there, and essentially get those rulers in debt to European powers. And so there was a kind of puppet rulers that were subordinate to whatever the French king or the British Parliament ordered them to do because they were so in debt to European businesses. So if you look at the map in the upper right, you see that sort of in North Africa, the western end of North Africa is really French territory, or at least sort of within the French sphere. Egypt and Sudan, the region below Sudan, is a British sphere of influence. The Italians are going to come into the region in between, but not until after the 20th century. And then if you look over at that central Arabian Peninsula leading all the way up to modern day Turkey, you see what was kind of the final nub of the Ottoman Empire on the cusp of World War I. The area in green, in kind of pale green, is the area ruled by the Turks. That is to say, the area that is still effectively controlled by Ottoman legal and military authority. On the bottom end of the Gulf there, of the Arabian Peninsula, along the kind of Gulf shore there, leading out to the Indian Ocean, those are, we talked about this before, those British forts that they maintain to be able to recoal their ships coming back and forth from India. They sort of develop friendly relations with the local tribes. They give them European, weapons and goods and stuff so they can dominate the other tribes. They maintain friendly relations with them so they can stop their ships there and refuel as they're going back and forth. But notice the kind of pale cream area in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula. Those are the deserts of Arabia that have really never been effectively under the control of any empire, going all the way back to the Romans and the ancient Persians. That's a kind of wild desert wilderness with no real towns and commerce. There's just sort of nomadic tribes for thousands of years, and on the cusp of World War I, that region has not been brought effectively under Ottoman control. So when we're thinking about the post-war settlement, the Ottoman lands of North Africa have essentially already long since been divvied up, right? They're not really at issue. What we're really thinking about is that core area of the Arabian Peninsula leading up to modern-day Turkey. Now, there's going to be a revolution in Turkey. That is kind of the ethnic Turks are going to rise up under this guy Kemal Ataturk, and he's going to essentially overthrow the Ottoman Sultan and the corrupt old royal regime, and he's going to establish a nationalistic government, that is, a government for the Turks, and declare it as Turkey. And essentially what you see in Wilson's point 12 is that the European powers essentially acknowledge that the Turks are something like the equivalent of the Poles and the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Slavs that they recognize of Europe. That the Turks are sort of, if you will, the civilized, the advanced civilized vanguard of the old Ottoman Empire, and so the Europeans are willing to grant them something like national statehood. So we're left with the remainder, right? We're left with essentially the area below modern Turkey, including Palestine and the Arabian Peninsula. Now, if you look at the image on the lower right of the screen, this is a map of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. So this is in the middle of the war. And in fact, it's just on the cusp of the British coming into this region in their Palestine campaign and their Mesopotamia campaign. This is an agreement that the French and the British came to of how they would divvy up the region after the British had conquered it. The French have many, many more troops than the British in Western Europe, and that's a kind of complaint of the French. There are more French soldiers dying in the trenches of Europe than Britain. Britain's retort is, well, we have to maintain this global colonial empire because it's our colonies that are providing us with all the supplies that are allowing us to win the war. So there's this kind of back and forth between France and Britain. France does not have a significant number of troops, and they have a very small navy. Of course, France is a great land power in Europe, and so it really falls to the British to carry out this kind of theater of the war. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement is a negotiation when the British start their campaign, essentially the British guaranteeing to the French, yes, we're going to go in and conquer all this territory, but don't worry, we won't keep it for ourselves at the end of the war. We'll share it with you. And you can see the essential division is a sort of a southeast and northwest zones. So if you look at the map in the lower right-hand corner, that red, the dark red, is the British area of primary governance. And what is that? That's the mouth of the Persian Gulf, right? They've already got those protectorates along the coast of the Gulf, those friendly tribes. They just want to extend that sphere up into the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, all the way up to Baghdad, Babylon. And then and then if you look at the northern section, the dark blue, that will be the French area. Now to the extent that there are towns and commerce and markets and business people in this region, they're primarily concentrated in those Syrian cities, especially Aleppo and Adara and the other major cities. Damascus. And so essentially the division here is France, we will give you all the business and everything that's valuable about business and economics and productivity in this region we're about to conquer, but we want to get access to the oil, and we want to be able to secure our transportation routes for that oil out of the zone. And so the Sykes-Picot Agreement is a kind of the initial informal negotiations that then will become codified and ratified by the League of Nations in 1920 under the San Remo Agreement. The map in the lower left of the screen then shows the final, if you will, kind of official legal settlement of the region. You'll notice the independent Republic of Turkey on the north of the map, the independent Iran on the eastern side. Notice the French Mandate of Syria, the British Mandate of Mesopotamia, then a British Mandate of Palestine, and then these two other independent nations, Kuwait and Lebanon. So, first, what are the mandates? What does that mean? The French Mandate of Syria and the British Mandate of Mesopotamia and Palestine. A mandate is a new term used as a kind of certification by the League of Nations as a kind of semi-nationhood status. France, we are giving you responsibility for this region, but it is not a French colony. You have a mandate. You have a responsibility imposed on you by us, by the League of Nations, to develop the peoples that live in this region to a state of civilization, right? This is the kind of language Europeans would use, to a kind of state of sophistication in their ability for self-governance that they can become their own independent nation. It's a kind of temporary colonial status, if you will. And the League of Nations creates three of these. The French mandate for Syria, the British mandate for Mesopotamia, what we become Iraq, and the British mandate for Palestine. Now, these two independent countries, Lebanon and Kuwait, are both really interesting. Lebanon is a very complicated region. It's on the coast of the Mediterranean, and it has an enormously kind of diverse religious population as part of Palestine. But among that mix are a group of French Christians called the Maronites, who are the descendants of crusaders from the 11th and 12th centuries, these kind of French knights that went and fought and for Jerusalem. They failed, but they took up residence on the north end of the shore, and before long they developed communities. That group of Maronites had always been sort of the special prerogative of the French. The French charities, French churches, and whatnot raised money to kind of support them for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. When the French had the opportunity then, and were given this mandate, they carved out a chunk of the coast and they wrote a constitution for Lebanon that they thought would guarantee a Christian president of this polyglot country. So we'll have a chance to come back and talk more about Lebanon later. Kuwait is also interesting. The British discover very quickly when they enter into Mesopotamia that they are going to have a heck of a time maintaining order. There are riots and tumults and resistance to British rule. This area, when it becomes Iraq, is going to be a constant source of unrest and disturbance. And the British had developed friendly relationships long preceding this with the Al-Shabaab royal family sort of at the northern end of the Persian Gulf. And so they saw sort of an opportunity for stability in this one region that they did have friendly relationships with the local royalty. And they had this absolutely mess of a military project up in Iraq. So they want to carve out a separate nation, really to have stability and order at that lower end of this project. So you see that the peoples that lived in this region did not get treated in the same way that the Poles and the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Romanians, etc., got treated in Europe. And that legacy is going to be at the root of the politics of nationalization and post-colonialism that we're going to talk about a great deal in this next section of the class. This specific settlement of the region is again going to get kind of the game pieces thrown up into the air again at the end of World War II, and we're going to get another major redivision, and we're going to get the modern nation states that we know today. Once the former legal settlement is arranged by 1920, the Western powers then can proceed to divvying up the oil reserves in this region. And that's the final piece of Jurgens Chapter 9, are the negotiations among both the national governments and also the oil companies within those governments, right? They're two independent forces, even though they're sort of aligned. That is, the American companies are trying to be aligned with American foreign policy, and the British with the British government, etc. Those are still varying levels of independence among those actors, and they're going to spend the 1920s sort of surveying the region, assessing the oil claims of the Ottomans that the Ottoman Empire possessed when it still was in existence, and then renegotiating, ultimately coming up to what's known as the Red Line Agreement of 1928. And essentially what the Red Line Agreement's going to do is draw a big red line around all those Ottoman lands. Now, it's very important to notice that Iran or Persia was never part of the Ottoman Empire. At least it wasn't at the moment that the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And so Iran or Persia is always going to be outside of this agreement. That will be very consequential when we get to the post-World War II period. Within this red line region, right, these companies come together. Shell, Anglo-Persian, right, which is also BP. BP is sort of the retail outlets within Britain for the Anglo-Persian company. The French National Oil Company, Petro Company of France, and then what's called the Near East Development Company, which is a syndicate of U.S. firms organized by the U.S. government in order to participate and be able to make claims. And this guy, Saloust Gulbenkian, Mr. 5%. These are the key actors. Now, who is Gulbenkian? He's a minor official banker in the Ottoman Empire before World War I. He's essentially the bureaucrat that had the legal right to sign off on oil leases under the authority of the Sultan. So, when the Ottoman Empire collapses, the Allies recruit him and they say, you are the guy with the legal authority to sign this paperwork giving us the legal right right to search for oil within the former Ottoman Empire. So he has a kind of stranglehold because he's the guy who can legitimize what they're doing, or at least give a kind of legal patina to what they're doing. He's called Mr. 5% because he gets, according to the Red Line Agreement, 5% of all the revenue from all the oil generated in this entire region. To this day, the Gulbenkians, I think they still live in France, are among the richest family in the world. Now, the best geologic science tells these oil companies that the oil is to be found essentially in northern Iraq down into southern Turkey. That is to say, they're following the Zagros mountain line and line, and they understand that on the east side, right, that already belongs to Britain under the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. In other words, no one at this moment is really thinking that those vast deserts of the Saudi Arabian interior actually possess oil, or that there's offshore oiling in the drilling in the Persian Gulf, which we know, of course, today the largest oil deposits in the entire world are sitting underneath the middle of that desert. But they're really not negotiating. That's going to be important because the French and the British are largely going to concentrate in Iraq, and especially the northern part of Iraq. And so what's left over for the U.S. companies, they end up mucking around down in the desert because they have the least advantageous claims, and they're actually going to strike at rich, right? They're going to actually stumble upon because the French and the British aren't so interested in that region. Now, the key element of the Red Line Agreement is what Jürgen describes as the self-denying clause. That is to say, these independent companies are coming together to form this group, the Turkish Petroleum Company, and they all agree no matter who hits what oil in any region within the red line, we all share the proceeds by the percentages we agreed on at the beginning, right? And Jürgen gives you the different percentages of revenue for the different groups. The U.S. syndicate has by far the smallest share among these groups, but they all share according to those percentages, not equally, right, but according to the percentages that they agreed on, no matter which nation's company actually discovers and starts pumping the oil, they're all going to share in it according to the agreed percentages. So it is the first international cartel agreement. It's also one of the great kind of imperial resource robberies of the 19th and 20th century, right? The subject peoples in this region are not being asked what they think about the agreement that the Turkish Petroleum Company has come to. No one is asking the Iraqis or the Arabians or the Syrians or the Jordanians if they want to sell their oil at the terms being negotiated in European capitals. And so there's a great kind of act of imperial piracy that's happening here at the same moment. And again, it's important to understand this because this Red Line Agreement, from the Sykes-Picot to the San Remo to the Red Line Agreement, is the source of the anger and resentment of the post-colonial period when Iraqis and Saudi Arabians and Syrians come into full nationhood. They are going to have a very clear memory of how the Europeans treated them at the end of World War I. And that backdrop is really important for you to take with you into the succeeding chapters in Jürgen. Okay, let's leave chapter 10 there, and we'll pick up with chapter 11 in the next class session.